Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for August 24th, 2021. I'm going to stick one more day with the situation around Afghanistan because it provides us a perfect opportunity to address the problems that not only got us into trouble in Afghanistan, but all the endless wars, all the endless bailouts, the austerity, the collapse of the physical economy. All of this goes back to a single root which has not fully been investigated or exposed, except by the work of the LaRouche Organization, largely because of the insistence of Lyndon LaRouche that you need to know the enemy if you're going to solve the problems. So we have a unique opportunity to address the crisis which is plaguing all of mankind right now, which we must take. And that is to use this to go to the fundamentals. Now, what are the fundamentals? The United Kingdom and the City of London has been manipulating the U.S. with various degrees of success since the end of World War II and the death of Franklin Roosevelt. There were some bumps in the way. Eisenhower kicked their rear ends out of Suez in 1956. John Kennedy was moving against the Brits before his assassination. There were efforts to try to address the financial crisis by some people, but at each point, the failure to get to the fundamentals that it was the British and British-oriented U.S. political networks and especially financial networks that were the problem. That's why we're still in this crisis today. Now, let's start with one of the most basic. Why were we in Afghanistan? What was 9/11 about? Have we fully exposed and gotten to the roots of 9/11? Was it the Afghan government, or the Afghan people who launched 9/11? The mythology is that bin Laden was operating from caves where he was protected by the Taliban. Was the coordinated activities of September 11th, 2001 actually done from caves in Afghanistan? What about the role of the Saudis? Senator Bob Graham had a committee to look into this, and they put out a report where they identified all kinds of networks, including the ambassador to the United States of Saudi Arabia, Prince Bandar, the connection between Bandar and the Saudis to Cheney through Halliburton, to Bush, to the U.S. intelligence community. So the 9/11 victims' families have been demanding full expose of the Saudi role. Release the documents. It hasn't been done. Why? Who's being protected? Now, this is crucial because we went to Afghanistan because of allegedly the bin Laden networks. Well, bin Laden was a Saudi. Who was funding the bin Laden operation going back to the 1980s? It was the CIA and the Saudis. So the question of should we have gone to war in Afghanistan is a real question. And that has a lot to do with getting to the bottom of what happened actually on 9/11. What was the role of U.S. intelligence? Was it incompetence? Was it cover-up? What did the British know? And then there's the whole Iraq war. Why did we go to war with Iraq? In this case, it was British intelligence in the form of the MI6 director at the time, Sir Richard Dearloffe, who produced a dossier which conveniently gave the Bush-Cheney administration the excuse, the justification to go after Saddam Hussein, who had nothing to do with 9/11 as we know. Now, remember, Sir Richard Dearloffe was the patron of Christopher Steele, who drafted the dodgy dossier against Donald Trump, which was at the heart of Russiagate. But I'll come back to that in a moment. What about the Patriot Act? We have a police state spying operation which collects metadata on every call you make, every email you send, every time you log on to the internet. Has this made us more secure? Obviously not. Did these wars, has that made us more secure? Well, we haven't had the same attacks on the homeland. But maybe the attacks on the homeland occurred because they were part of a false flag operation to justify more of these wars. That brings us to another question. Who's who pushes the false flags that ends up having us bomb other countries, that has us in a military buildup against China and Russia today? Will there be wars against China and Russia coming from these same networks, claiming that we're being threatened by the Chinese and the Russian military, which spend a fraction of what we spend on our military? And with all we spend on our military, we couldn't win the war in Afghanistan. Now, finally, have we unraveled the real story behind Russiagate? Obviously, there's a connection from 9/11 in 2001 to Russiagate beginning in 2016, the end of 2015, 2016. Christopher Steele is one aspect of that. Sir Richard Dearloffe, GCHQ coming to John Brennan saying, we have the goods on Russian spying, Russian meddling against the United States. Well, what were those goods? They were frauds. This was designed to prevent an elected U.S. president from moving away from British geopolitical doctrine, which calls for provocations and confrontations with Russia and China, instead into cooperation. That's what Trump was talking about. End these hostile acts, move toward a dialogue where you can have cooperation to address the real problems, poverty, disease, and so on. And instead, we ended up with 4 years and millions of dollars spent, people going to jail who committed no crime because the establishment, which in this case is the British-linked American intelligence and political and media establishment tied to the City of London, which for their own benefit intended to keep us in these wars to prevent Trump from developing a positive, friendly, cooperative relationship with Vladimir Putin. And what are we seeing alongside this? The neoliberal economic policies, which benefit the same people. Globalization, who benefits from this? The Davos billionaires, the speculators, not the average American whose factory was shut down, whose jobs were sent overseas, who can barely make ends meet, who were looted in the S&L crisis in the 80s, looted in the mortgage-backed security crisis in the first decade of this century, who are being destroyed today by the lockdowns and by the policies that are defending an unfair, globalized free trade system that only works for the most wealthy. So when you look at these things, then ask yourself, who's most hysterical today about the Afghanistan war, claiming we have to go back in? Let me just give you a couple of quotes. We had the quotes from Tony Blair yesterday, who said it's imbecilic to be against never-ending wars. He didn't say it was bad the way Biden pulled out. He said we shouldn't have pulled out. We should stay in. We have to fight these wars. We need to have the long view. What's the long view? The empire comes first. Now listen to this. This is from Andrew Rawnsley of The Observer. He said, what happened is global Britain, which is the policy of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has been exposed as impotent and friendless. Well, this is an attempt to revise the whole theory of the British Empire. And it didn't work. It's not going to work. It is a commitment to keep the United States at confrontation and near war with Russia and China in the Black Sea and the Crimea in Ukraine, and then against China in the Indo-Pacific region. So Rawnsley said, Mr. Johnson's capacity to influence Mr. Biden was less than that of the president's dog. Well, that's pretty blatant, huh? Theresa May in Parliament asked the question, where is global Britain on the streets of Kabul? Well, why should global Britain be on the streets of Kabul? Rawnsley went on to say that the United Kingdom has, quote, lots of vital interests around the world, around the globe, but not the means to safeguard them by itself, unquote. So what does that mean? The U.S. has to do it. We have to fight these wars so the British can continue to loot poorer countries and use the United States as the dumb giant to enforce imperial policy. Then the former commander of British troops in Afghanistan, Colonel Richard Kemp, said, Biden shouldn't be impeached. He should be court-martialed for betraying the USA and the United States Armed Forces, unquote. Now, along the same lines, we saw Nikki Haley and Liz Cheney. What are they saying? Stay in Afghanistan. Don't pull out the troops. They're willing, along with the British, to fight to the last American soldier. These are imperial forces who financially benefit. Liz Cheney's father was Dick Cheney, who is the author of these wars, one of the authors. Nikki Haley is a rabid defender of British imperial interests and challenging Russia and China. So when you look at this question of what's shaping U.S. policy, go to the British. Take the advice of LaRouche. We have to get out of these endless wars, which means we have to get out of British geopolitics. We have to redefine what are the true American interests globally. And that starts with restoring a credit system to the United States. And I just wrote a piece that I'll talk about more tomorrow on, are we becoming a parliamentary system in the United States instead of a presidential system? The key to a presidential system is the president as chief executive has enormous capability to make policy. But most important is to safeguard the United States as a credit system, where the government produces credit in the form of money to feed the physical economy, as opposed to using central banks operating on behalf of private banks to loot the economy and loot the citizens. So these are some of the lessons. The American people are going to have to stop fulminating and yelling and screaming, Biden did this, or the Democrats have to drop, Trump did this. The reality is, as a nation, we've been on the wrong course, especially since 1971 economically, and strategically since the period in which Zbigniew Brzezinski became the financial or the security advisor to President Jimmy Carter in the late 70s. You look at those 2 points, trace the connections. Who made the policy? Who benefited from the policy? Who's the one screaming today to stick with that policy? Those are the people who have to be removed from office. Those are the policies which have to be changed. And I think it's crucial that we do what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has said, use this situation today as an opportunity to break with this geopolitical doctrine and bring the United States into a cooperative relationship with other great powers to restore a global fixed exchange rate, Bretton Woods type system with a commitment to eradicate poverty, eradicate disease, and provide justice to every person on the planet. Thanks for joining me, and I'll be back again tomorrow.